Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the third in the series of talks being run by the Centre for American Studies on themes related to the election, the forthcoming election in 12 days. If anybody's an insomniac, you can stay awake tonight and watch the final presidential debate. But whereas that will probably be a seedy and rather grubby affair, hopefully the next hour will be informative and fun. We've got four of my colleagues who are going to I'll introduce them, but they'll introduce the topics. So first of all, Professor George Lewis is going to yak away. Then Deborah Toner. Hello, Deborah. Then we'll hand over to Guy Barefoot before finishing with a bang with Zalfa, who is going to not do thumbs down. Okay, without further ado, I'll shush. What I'm going to do is, if people want to ask questions as we go along, please put things in the chat box as we're moving along. And then at the end, if people want to use the raise hand function and ask questions, that would be great. But as we're moving along, please put stuff in the chat and I'll monitor that and make sure that good and relevant questions get answered at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to George.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Can you hear me all right? People hear me? Yeah, okay, good. So as you'll have seen, to show my bipartisan stripes, I'm wearing a Tea Party t-shirt and an Ojamas scarf. The Tea Party t-shirt was free and I had to pay for the Ojamas one, which I think is only right. I actually pinched 5 of the free t-shirts because I thought that the Faculty of Arts 5-a-side football team could wear them as a uniform, but everybody refused to wear them, which also is telling. But that's not why we're here. So Black Lives Matter. One of the first and perhaps most important points to make here, I think, is that it's quite interesting that we've made space for a whole event on Black Lives Matter and this presidential election. And I say that because even if we just go back as far as the Democrat National Convention of 2016, what is telling there is that there is no discussion whatsoever of Black Lives Matter. And I think it's become so much part of the lingua franca of American politics that it's very easy to remember that how recent it is and what an impact it's made in such a very short period of time. Now, that said, I think it'd be disingenuous not to broader historical trajectory here, not just because I'm a historian by background, but also because of the longer arc that's involved here. And you might think perhaps of Martin Luther King's, there is a long arc of history and it bends towards justice. That long arc allows us, I think, to understand that despite the relative recent emergence of the movement, it has long roots and it draws on deeply ingrained traditions. And I think, as I hope I'll try and explain now, that each of those helps us to understand its significance and where its significance will lie in the elections. To begin with, I also think it's interesting, and especially in terms of Trump's obvious and often open misogyny, that Alicia Garza, one of the main 3 foundational figures, was also one of 3 women who established Black Lives Matter's presence. If we look back to the 1950s and 1960s, there was then also open misogyny, often from within the Black church, which spawned so much of the leadership of the nonviolent side of the civil rights movement. But then, too, it took a formidable woman, Ella Baker, who encouraged student activists to form their own civil rights organisation, which became the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, popularly known as SNCC. And it's interesting here, too, that it was on Baker's suggestion that SNCC opted for group-centred leadership, in contrast to Martin Luther King and SCLC's leader-centred group. So that flat organising structure of group-centred leadership is, of course, exactly what Black Lives Matter has tried to develop. And even more interesting, to me at least, if you want to follow the historical threads, is that one of those early co-founders of Black Lives Matter, Patrisse Cullors, now works at the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights. So it's kind of bringing the circle right round to Ella Baker's influence. Now, Garza also has noted 2 distinct rationales for the continued spread and increase in the influence of Black Lives Matter. The first is the overt racism of Trump, which, as many of you will know, started before his now infamous Mexican rapists escalator moment. and can be traced back, at least in public, to his response to Central Park 5 in 1989. And I'm sure that you'd find earlier examples if you wanted to look that hard. But the second is that in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, the pandemic lockdown, Gaza thinks, meant that more people were at home and able to see the footage which had been captured of Floyd's murder. And that then, she claimed, increased its impact on society and on the political sphere. I'm slightly sceptical of that, given the prevalence of smartphones and the ability to watch anything, anywhere, at any time. I mean, who knows, those of you who are here, you might be on a bus, you might be on a train, you might be in a cafe, you might be at home. But again, I think it highlights two important long strands of history. First is that the strategy of non-violent direct action from the classical phase of 1950s and 60s civil rights activism rested upon the ability to identify acts, places, or agents of obvious overt racism which to attack. Secondly, I think that framing images of protesters' confrontation with that overt racism was crucial to the strategy's success in the 50s and 60s. Technology used by Black Lives Matter means that it's now easier to capture and also to publish the images of that strategy in progress. And I think that's been crucial to Black Lives Matter's ability to increase pressure for real political change. Thinking back, remember that JFK had no real desire to be a civil rights president in his first 2 years. In fact, he thought the civil rights protest was embarrassing to the United States on the Cold War stage. But it was once he'd seen the live footage of protesters being brutally and viscerally attacked by Bull Connor's segregationist police and the posse in Birmingham, Alabama, that he was sufficiently astute a politician to realise that he had to act. So the movement had left him with no alternative in 1963. Black Lives Matter will hope to have done the same in 2020. And in that vein, I think it's also important to look at the context in which Black Lives Matter is operating and to re-emphasise that racism has not suddenly blossomed under Trump after years in abeyance. Rather, I would argue that Trump has allowed and often encouraged a safe space in which open racism and white supremacy can operate. And as I've argued before, did segregationists suddenly and collectively undergo some great collective Damascene conversion to racial equality in 1964 and 1965 because of Civil and Voting Rights Acts? No, of course they didn't. Did they disappear? Well, from public view, many of them did, though not all of them. But that leaves the question of, in the Trump era, why engage in the relative subtleties of dog whistle politics if your commander-in-chief has a megaphone marked racism in one hand and a klaxon marked white supremacy in the other hand? Small hand or otherwise, I won't comment on the size of the hands. When she was talking in 2016, Gaza identified two main drivers in Black Lives Matter's relationship with political policy. Each of which, and I think is particularly interesting, each of which to be in tension with the other. First, she noted that it was a disillusionment with mainstream politics that led to her and many fellow community organisers turning instead to direct action protest. Here too, we see a correlation with one of the most important historical theses of the classical civil rights movement era. As a historian, J. Mills Thornton III, he could only be American with a name like that. J. Mills Thornton III has argued that trying to understand why some local southern locales experienced civil rights protests while others didn't, nonviolent direct action tended to take place where there had once been a real possibility of meaningful interracial dialogue at a municipal local level, but that dialogue was then shut off, and it was shut off by changes in local politics, which brought open segregationists into positions of power and shut off that dialogue. If there's no meaningful dialogue where once there had been, what can you do? Well, you protest, and you protest well. Secondly, Gaza noted the need for clear shared policy drives. Although she simultaneously agreed that it was difficult to agree policy with a flat group-centered leadership which Black Lives Matter had adopted. Some of those policies were clear and clearly accepted across the group, so raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour and also reducing the number of police in schools, and that was a bid to fracture the school to prison pipeline. Just like the classical phase of civil rights activism from the 50s and 60s, however, attempting to agree that policy across a mass participation, non-hierarchical group led to fissures and to splits. So on the one hand now, for example, we have the Black Futures Lab, of which Gaza is a principal and which is putting some policy forward, but other initiatives. And you might see, for example, Ice Cube's contract with Black America, which is now foremost, I think, in some of the policy attempts for Black Lives Matter advocates. Been a long way. Ice Cube might be just out of Compton, but he's now contracting with Black America and doing deals or trying to do deals with the Trump administration. So to finish, I think just to try to explain those tensions, we might return to the presidency and the impact of Black Lives Matter on this election. It's, of course, an apparent irony, at least at first glance, that Black Lives Matter came to prominence during the presidency of the first African American to hold that office. That, though, I think also reflects the tensions to which I referred, the divergent views on the efficacy of engaging with presidential politics within Black Lives Matter. On the one hand, Obama, as we know, was himself a local community organizer who decided to engage with electoral politics because he identified that as his best chance of making a difference. But on the other hand, Black Lives Matter was founded during his presidency because of the belief that Obama was a living exemplar of the limitations of driving real meaningful change through that mainstream political process. So where does that leave us? Well, historically, there's a long tradition of grassroots civil rights protesters navigating the shift to mainstream politics successfully. If we gloss over Martin Luther King's close aide, Big Ralph Abernathy, who had a disastrous flirtation with the Reagan administration, other figures, John Lewis, Andrew Young, Fannie Lou Hamer, to name but three, they all transitioned to mainstream political success from long spells honing their craft in grassroots mobilization and protest. But there remains something counterintuitive, I think, at play in terms of Black Lives Matter's targets in the presidential political cycle. Starting in 2016, the target of their protests during presidential campaigns has been found more often than not on the left, that's, as you're looking, that's probably your left, on the left than on the right. Bernie Sanders, for example, has faced far more disruption from Black Lives Matter folk than Trump did. Why? Well, here, I think, and what we'll see in the coming days, lies pragmatism over purity. Trump is simply not going to change his policies because of Black Lives Matter. If anything, it's quite the opposite. And he has and will use any such protest as yet more red meat for his base and to rouse his base into action. Bernie and then Biden, on the other hand, have been in a much more likely, I think, to shift their relative positions to appease this constituency that they have so long sought to court. I'll stop there, but I'm happy to pick up any of that later in questions. If anyone wants to.
That's fantastic, George. Thanks ever so much. I should have said at the start that we are recording, which shouldn't put anyone off, but maybe temperate language if you ask a question verbally. We'll move on to Deborah. Do you want to take it away?
Okay, thanks, Alex. I'm afraid my thoughts are probably going to be quite a bit more rambling than George's, so I'll do my best. But picking up on one of the threads that George introduced around the longer arc, I guess, of not just the Black Lives Matter movement, but the broader set of issues, I think, that it's brought to the very forefront of political and indeed cultural discourse. So you'll all be well aware that a lot of the protests that have taken place this year in the United States as well as in the UK have been centred around particular statues that are commemorating particular figures within US and indeed British imperial history that have connections to either slaveholding or the US Civil War, or the broader history of colonialism and imperialism. And so essentially what I'm going to concentrate on is thinking about the question of how histories are commemorated, and how that issue's become politicized in the course of the US election that's going on right now, but in a broader sense across the course of 2020. One of the statue topplings that particularly, to be quite honest, entertained me greatly was the toppling of a statue of Christopher Columbus in the US, which did the rounds on Twitter as the statue met a large body of water with the caption, "Columbus discovers lake." And this entertained me greatly, chiefly because some of the students who are here today may be eagerly anticipating taking the course Indigenous Peoples of the Americas with me next semester. This is essentially the question and the problem with which that module starts. What does it mean to treat the Christopher Columbus's voyage to the Americas as the discovery of America? And I mean that in the sense of what does it mean for how we understand the history of the United States, but more broadly, the history of the Americas, to treat that moment as a discovery. And so in thinking about that issue and picking it apart, it involves looking at the multidimensionality of history and the way we tell it, but also the way we remember it. And statues, in terms of the form of commemoration they represent, are just one way in which history is remembered and displayed. So both in the US context and in the British context, where different statues have been either toppled or defaced or protested in some way, have been largely framed by those elements of the political spectrum who find it a disturbing turn of events to challenge statues in this way as a form of erasing history. To take down or to deface or otherwise comment on the statue's existence have been represented as a form of erasing history. So very much I would come from that process from the opposite perspective, to see it as a process of history and making, in that this is a perfectly natural part of the historical process to revise, reframe, question, reshape as we learn new things. And indeed, it also part of this discussion should be thinking about where the statues came from in the first place, at what particular moment of historical time they were actually erected, and what political purpose they served at those moments. And altogether, that story of how particular statues were created and why, and then at the end of that process, how and why those statues were taken down, is part of one connected history with multiple perspectives to think about. So if you take the example of the Christopher Columbus statue and the different ways in which Christopher Columbus has been commemorated in US history, Columbus started to be held up as a hero and emblem of United States history even before the United States as a nation was founded, and indeed as part of that process in the 1760s and 1770s. And at that time, Columbus was represented as a symbol of many of the things that he still stands for now in the eyes of Donald Trump and many others like him, as a process of discovery, of American greatness, of American exceptionalism, and of bringing advancement and civilization to the nation and the world at large. In his address to the nation, his proclamation of Columbus Day celebration on the 9th of October, so very recent and contemporary, Trump said a number of things in this vein, accusing anyone who mentions anything negative about Christopher Columbus's legacy as being extremists, radical activists, refusing to learn from our history, to deprive it of any splendour, to erase Christopher Columbus from our national heritage. So these are some of the ideas that have been advanced very recently about what challenging the foundational history that such statues means for us in this contemporary moment. It probably won't surprise any of you to know that basically I would advocate for the complete opposite, that by talking about the atrocities committed by Christopher Columbus, by talking about the negative aspects of his impact on the Americas, and by recognizing its complexity and challenging the meaning of what statues like those have come to represent, we actually understand American history so much better. And indeed, not just American history, but the history of all of us. So I'm basically going to stop there, really, just to think about, just to reiterate the point that the process of challenging the way that we commemorate history is as much a part of that historical story itself as indeed thinking about the origins behind how it was created. So I think I've demonstrated my point with which I started, that was going to be quite a bit more rambling than George's, but but yeah, happy to talk about other examples of statues and all the kind of different aspects of whether or not we're erasing history by attacking them or bringing them down or drawing moustaches on them, brings up for everyone. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
That's great, Deborah. Thanks. Anything but rambling, and that's from somebody who can ramble. That really wasn't a ramble. It was lots to chew on and think about from both George and Deborah so far. I'm going to hand over now to Guy, who's going to talk to us about race and film. So over to you, Guy.
Somebody said, can you see what's on my screen? Can you see the defiant ones? Hello?
Not at the moment, no, sorry.
No. Okay.
Do you want me to go for it then, guys?
Yeah,
Shall I share for you? Let's have a try.
Yes, we can now. That's great.
Yeah,
I can see your screen, Guy Barefoot.
Okay. Turn myself on. I was going to say I wasn't sure what on earth that mine had any connection with what others have said. There's perhaps, I'm talking a bit about history in a different sense from Deborah, but maybe there is some sort of connection there. Almost total lack of contemporary links here, I'm afraid. But what I have to say comes from a sequence from I'm Not Your Negro, Bob Peck's 2016 film about James Baldwin, and a sequence where it focuses on The Defiant Ones, the 1958 film that stars, hang on a second, sorry. I need to, if I move on, Zelfa, how can I do that on this screen?
Try pressing the forward button. Have a try.
Yeah, but I tried that and it doesn't.
All right, you're going to have to get me to do it. Shall I move on?
Shall I just say next slide when I want next slide?
Go for it.
Okay. So basically, film starring Sidney Poitier and Tony Curtis as black and white escaped prisoners who start the film change to each other, and in the course of the film, what we move from racial conflict becoming mutual support, even affection. And can we click on? So at the end of the film, we see the Poitier character jump aboard a train that can take him to freedom, but then jump off the train so as not to abandon the white man who's become his friend. The Defiant One was a critically well-received film. Writing about it, however, in The Devil Finds Work, Baldwin provides a different perspective, and his comments about the ending of the 1958 film are used in I Am Not Your Negro. So next slide, please. Accompanying footage of Poitier and Curtis. We hear the voice of Samuel L. Jackson as Baldwin saying, as it says on the screen, when Sydney jumps off the train, the white Liberal people downtown are much relieved and joyful. Next slide. But when black people saw him off the train, they yelled, next slide, get back on the train, you fool. So in part, that tells us something about film and about film representation. While it's possible to notice shifts in the representation of African Americans in the 1950s, Baldwin points to the limitations of this. Next slide. As he goes on to say about the film, as he quoted in I'm Not Your Negro, that jump from the train is there to provide some audiences with some reassurance. But there's more going on here. And so going back from I'm Not Your Negro to The Devil Finds Work, and next slide, please, made me realize that the 2016 documentary, first of all, missed out on the credit that Baldwin gave to Poitier's presence and performance, which Baldwin describes as lending the film its only real distinction, also paradoxically smashing it to pieces. However, what also struck me about that passage in The Devil Finds Work was what it had to say about audiences, identified a little more precisely there as the Harlem audience. So if looking at films from this period ultimately means looking at lies, what might it mean to look or listen to audiences? And if we're talking about Black Lives Matter in the context of cinema history, it's good to look at audiences as well as films, given the ability of audiences to articulate their own response, to shout, get back on the train, you fool. But what I want to do very briefly here is to point just to some of the challenges of this. Baldwin's comment on how Harlem audiences responded in The Defiant One is striking. In part, it is because it is, to me at least, unusual. There's now a body of literature about images of African Americans on the screen, about the extent to which they've been kept off the screen. And there's some broad theoretical work on differences within film spectatorship. There's some material on historical Black audiences, though what I know of is focused more on early cinema than on the 1950s. And moving beyond Harlem and beyond metropolitan America, that can partly be explained by the fact that Black audiences had difficulty even in getting access to the cinema. Next slide, please. However, the point here is also that prohibition can be hidden. Images like that one exist, but are relatively rare. And one researcher on early North Carolina cinemas, Robert Allen, has spoken of asking his students to look for evidence of whether or not African Americans were part of the emerging cinema audience in the early 20th century, and of those students speculating that they were part of that audience since they did not find explicit prohibition in newspaper advertisements. And Allen had to explain to them that since Jim Crow segregation was so deeply embedded in these communities, its explicit articulation was not needed. And my own study of cinema listings in 1950s newspapers has only occasionally revealed that explicit prohibition or segregation. And in my very brief, what I have to say, I'm just going to take two small examples, and they're examples from drive-ins in the 1950s, since that's what I've been working on. They come from North Carolina and from Arizona, which as potential red to blue swing states is about as close as I get to a link to the election. In terms of the literature on the topic on drive-in cinemas, some of that literature do talk about those cinemas as integrated spaces. I think the evidence for that is fairly thin, and certainly the evidence in places point to a rather different picture. My first example is a reference to different cinema audiences from the Chowan Herald in Edenton, North Carolina. An announcement in the paper of the opening of the Highway 17 drive-in half a mile north of the town in May 1950. And the paper noted that a section will also be reserved for coloured people. And that's it, basically. So in this particular cinema, the only reference I've seen from that newspaper to an African-American audiences across the 1950s, that's the only example. One might look also at what was shown in the cinema. For instance, the drive-in at one stage showed Carmen Jones, the Otto Preminger directed version of Carmen with an all-black cast, while the Eden Theatre in the town itself on one Friday and Saturday showed Birth of so the film from some time back. So one can speculate on different audiences, but on the whole, in this particular example, what was significant was the absence of evidence. My second brief example moves away from African-American audiences to Hispanic audiences, and it comes from a pair of cinemas on West Van Buren Street in Phoenix, Arizona. And the address is significant in that Van Buren Street seems to have functioned as something of an internal border within Phoenix. There was a more relatively diverse community south of Van Buren, which was part Hispanic and part African-American, but at least as late as the 1930s, minorities were barred from buying property north of Van Buren. So it functioned as something of a dividing line, and it was along that dividing line that the twin drive-in opened in January 1951, initially with a north screen showing westerns and action films, and the south screen showing what was labelled as a variety program. And then that shifts. So subsequently, the north screen starts to show Spanish language films. When the cinema reopened in 1952, the south screen had become the Acres of Fun, and the north screen had become the Peso. And the Peso showed Spanish language films, usually a few years after their release, and continued to do so throughout the decade, after both cinemas had become part of the Southwest chain of drive-in cinemas. Thank you. So audience differentiation is more explicit in this instance, though also you can see that what is also more explicit is the hierarchy that one gets within these cinemas. So it's significant that at the top then we have the cinema park showing the latest Disney films. The Acres is in the middle, in this instance, instantly showing the Defiant Ones, and then that reappears again a sort of about 9 months later, following the Oscar ceremonies, this time including Sidney Poitier, although misspelling his name. So overall, I'm partly pointing to what I don't know rather than what I do, but my overall inconclusive conclusion is to point to an area for further research, if also to point to some of the challenges and barriers to that. Thank you.
Thanks, Guy. That's great. And lots again to pick up on there. I will hand over to Zalfa straight away so we can create room for some conversation and chat at the end. Where you go, Zalfa.
Thank you. So I'm going to briefly talk about critical race theory and Donald Trump's recent assault on it and a range of things, as usual. It's worth saying that I know the word theory can be quite maybe intimidating, but it's worth saying that many of you perhaps intuitively or implicitly understand the premises of critical race theory, especially if you've taken pretty much any module that any of the people here are offering. Because in modules, of course, about race and equality in the US, that's often the underpinning principle. So I'm going to try and do three things. I want to give a quick outline of critical race theory, and I mean really quick, and how we can use it to understand, or how it is used to understand the US. I want to try and link it up to the movement for Black Lives, and then if there's time, just briefly explain what it has to do with the election. So exactly 1 month ago, on the 22nd of September, Donald Trump issued an executive order combating, it's called the Executive Order Combating Race and Sex Stereotyping. So you look at it and you think, oh, that's good. Now, nowhere in the actual executive order do the words critical and race and theory appear next to each other, but it is an explicit attack on this way of understanding the world and this way of doing scholarship. So critical race theory sort of emerges in the 1970s as a response to what scholars have called the ebb and flow, I'll just say aftermath, I suppose, of the civil rights movement. And it starts out principally as a legal theory of justice. What that means on a basic level is that critical race theory has as its basic kind of underlying principle or premise that racism is systemic, it's endemic to the American story. It's the foundational basis on which the US was built, inadvertently or otherwise. It isn't a theory that's about, contrary to popular belief, it isn't a theory that's about identifying racism. That's racist, that's racist. That's not what it's about. It focuses on the importance of understanding the many and multifaceted factors that shape the ways that people perceive, experience, and respond to race and racism. We can't talk about race without talking about racism, but that, the reverse counts too. And critical race theory is what leads to critical whiteness studies, the acknowledgement, of course, that whiteness is not the norm, is not monolithic. It's from the intersection, I think, of these scholarly conversations that we get terms that, like, for example, white privilege and institutionalized racism and systemic racism and intersectionality, all terms that you'll have heard me use if you've ever taken a class with me, or and a range of my colleagues as well, of course. These are important, critical terms, but they're not terms that you need to use in everyday life all the time. But they are terms, of course, that you need to think about when thinking about race critically, and that's all that we're trying to do here. Understanding critical race theory is important to the way we analyze and follow the movement for Black lives, precisely, in my view, because it started out as a legal theory of justice. A legal theory that wants to combat the exclusionary, essentialist, and white supremacist and racist basis on which US laws were originally framed and written and kind of implemented. And the movement for Black lives is, in an important way, a movement in response to the murderous enforcement of the law, which is to say police and law enforcement need to stop murdering Black people. So what does this have to do with the election? Again, I'm not talking for a very long time. I'm not even coherent. So we can talk about this more in the questions if you'd like. So Trump's aim, I think, with the executive order, as it has been with everything that he says and does, has been to attempt to spark outrage that a marginal group of leftist extremists are trying to rewrite history. That's the outrage he's trying to spark. So the history that Deborah was talking about is unacceptable. This is something we've seen in the UK as well. Just yesterday on Twitter, I was watching a video, which I'll talk about in a moment. There's this fear of a full and textured and developed and ongoing history that isn't a finished product, but that is a work in progress. A fear that is so deep that actual knowledge is branded as an unpatriotic and wrong. We can't throw away, however, all the things that we actually know. We can't throw away the fact that Jefferson wasn't this untouchable hero, that indigenous people weren't just hanging out waiting to be civilized, that enslaved people didn't actually want to be enslaved. We can't forget that the US is built on the basis of fundamental racism. The executive order, I'll just read a little bit from it here, says that, this is the quote, as an example, our uniformed services should not teach our heroic men and women in uniform the lie that the country for which they are willing to die is fundamentally racist. Such teachings could directly threaten the cohesion and effectiveness of our uniformed services. So I find it interesting here, and as a literary critic, all I want to do is closely read that for like an hour. But the idea of this being a teaching, almost religious, cult-like in its following, critical race theory is not a cult. I'll say that. I think that's a quite uncontroversial thing to say. Trump says that critical race theory is being forced into our children's schools. He said it's being imposed into workplace training, and it's being deployed to rip apart friends, neighbors, and families, which I think is hilarious, seeing that that's coming from him. He's framing knowledge and history and scholarship and information based on expertise as un-American. And I think somebody here probably has a little bit more to say than I do about un-Americanism and what that means. But I suppose we shouldn't be surprised by this because he's so averse to actual expertise and actual, real, consistent facts. And he's doing this simply as a shibboleth, to borrow a plot point from the West Wing, a password, so that people who follow him on the right or the extreme right understand that he is on side. And what's worrying is that we're seeing the same thing, as I mentioned, happening in the UK. Just a couple of days ago, the Women and Equalities Minister called very specifically critical race theory and ideology. This suggests, of course, this same language is it's a teaching. In October, this is related to the fact that in October, so this month, time is away, the Department for Education issued guidance that said, this is a quote, schools should not use resources produced by organizations that take extreme political stances on matters. Examples of extreme political stances include a publicly stated desire to abolish or overthrow democracy, capitalism, opposition to the right of freedom of speech, or organization that promote victim narratives that are harmful to British society. And this is where Black Lives Matter comes back in, because the minister then followed up with, I am not a victim, and she's Black. So we're pretty much, just to wind down now and bring it back to the election, we're pretty much exactly 4 years to the week, I think, that it looked like Hillary Rodham Clinton was ahead in the polls, absolutely surefire to win, no problem. This is what it looks like today as well with Biden. And I think we're maybe all a little bit more skeptical of polls in 2020 than we were in 2016. I think we'd be right to continue our skepticism and use knowledge and facts to guide us in the way that we make our predictions and frame our hopes for 2 weeks' time, when we'll be here again, by the way, at 6 o'clock. Trump wants to cancel, and this is this fear of cancel culture. He wants to cancel these things he calls divisive concepts, but he's mobilizing them now more than ever in a last-ditch attempt to win. So it's important now for us to affirm that Black lives do matter. And I, for one, personally welcome using these divisive concepts to take the structures of white supremacy apart. I'm going to stop now.
That's fantastic, Zalfa. Thanks ever so much. And really, actually, after such an intellectually stimulating talk, it seems incredibly churlish to say, I think you're wrong about the polls. The polls are different this year than they were 4 years ago. And from the world's greatest pessimist, that's a statement. But I don't want to, that's for next week, folks, actually. We'll be talking about that next week. Please, people, can you put questions in the chat or use the raise hand function to get a conversation going? Just one thing that struck me listening to all of you was the way in which I can't think of a better word. It's not a phrase I particularly like, but the anti-intellectualism, I guess, in some ways of the criticism, the idea that we can rethink history. We can. It's almost as if, look, we passed the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s. That was a kumbaya moment, and we move on from that. And I think that's actually been seen in a way that there's the response of people who had the 1619 project, which the New York Times ran, and the sort of the response to that, which seems in many ways to encapsulate, to bring together lots of the things which you guys were saying in that. But please, can we get some questions in, or I'll just keep asking questions and Bledin, fire away.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
We can do indeed. Excellent.
Thanks to everyone for the presentations, and thanks for putting on this series of events. This is a very ill constructed question, so I apologise. I guess sort of thinking about sort of the levels of governance and the possible effect that a Biden presidency could have on race relations and politics in the US. If, say, Biden wins and BLM movement succeeds in, getting their sort of transformation in the Democratic Party sort of solidified, I suppose, if that's the right word to use it, through, a Biden win. Will that do anything to help change the politics of state governance and managing the police in specific cities, that where we saw the biggest sort of ruptures in those in those racial politics across some of the United States. So I guess it's how much effect do you see a Biden presidency has on fixing those sort of more local or state governance and policing issues? Thank you. Sorry for that rambled question.
So if you want to pick that up, I can answer that, but I would leave it to the panelists rather than the chair to provide an answer.
I'll leave it to you in the longer term, Alex, but all I would say, again, with my looking backwards, historian's head on, I know I should be looking the other direction. I think that the most positive response would be that for Biden, this has been a journey, because in the past, clearly with his crime bill in particular, he's shown that, he is not naturally, he's either a natural pragmatist and he's responding to what he thinks his electorate will want. And in the early 90s, that was a very strong federal crime bill. Or he is on a more liberalising journey, and Bernie Sanders will have pulled him more to the left, and the defunding the police and Black Lives Matter's role in that at the grassroots will help in that. I'm not. We talk about structural racism very often, and for very good reason. I think one of the structures that is often misunderstood is the extent to which local police forces rely on local income, which comes from stopping people and fining people. And I think until that is systemically changed, I can't see there being any real progressive change in the way that law enforcement works. So now over to the newly optimistic Alex for a much more optimistic view on that.
I'm not sure this is much more optimistic, but I'll be quick with this. Very practical level. One of the things that the Obama administration did was the Department of Justice would investigate local and police and city police forces if they were felt to be doing exactly what George has just said, if they felt there was discriminatory practices going on. Jeff Sessions, as Attorney General, one of his first actions was to bring to a halt to any such investigations, and I just assume that a Biden administration would begin those again. It's incremental, it's small, but it does at least send messages. We've got a question, Macaulay. You've got a question, please fire away.
Oh, hello there. My question. I believe Deborah touched on the history and the ideas of knocking down the statues and removing them. And I find that very, very interesting. And the question I have to ask is, do you think it makes more of an impact when people, break laws to take down the statues, rather than going through the process of trying to legally take down the statues?
Thanks, Macaulay. That's a really interesting question, and I from what I've observed this year, I think it does make a bigger impact, both in positive and negative ways. I think, in the sense, what I mean by that, I suppose, is that I forget the specific example now, to be quite honest, but there was one example
you referenced.
Pardon?
Referenced the Columbus statue.
Yeah, I'm thinking of, I think it was the one in Bristol, where the Edward Colston statue, there had been a sort of years-long campaign through normal bureaucratic channels to get that taken down and replaced with something else that acknowledged the history of the slave trade rather than commemorated a slave trader. So that example, I think, shows quite well that, the average person in the street probably wouldn't have heard of Edward Colston until his statue was torn down. So in the sense of it making a bigger impact to break the law and through civil disobedience to take down the statue by force, it certainly made a bigger impact in terms of public awareness of, frankly, even the existence of the statue. However, at the same time, I think it's also made a bigger impact in terms of the backlash against such actions, and the kind of discourse that I was talking about before around accusations of this erasing history, and imposing a kind of monolithic narrative on national history and sort of denigrating the nation and so on. Whereas But yeah, I mean, I think the straightforward answer to your question is yes, it does make a bigger impact, but in a couple of different ways.
Yeah, I have one small follow-up question onto that, and that's do you think such as Edward Colston, the removing of his statue, do you think that encouraged people to go out and do this to more statues? For example, Churchill. Do you believe that the acts that performed on the Churchill statue were justifiable, or would you support protecting statues that weren't of slave owners?
I mean, I'm not going to get into the. I'm not going to make a judgment on the justifiableness of these actions. I think that's a very elastic term. I think they're certainly all connected. Without the one, the other probably wouldn't have happened. In that, I think in response to your first question, the fact that these actions, these direct and very public actions, caused a big media splash, and that has a kind of ripple effect that multiplies and then carries forward into other kinds of contexts and protests. So I guess there's two parts to that answer, really. One, in that, yeah, I think the two things are definitely connected. They've got slightly different. The second part then is they've got slightly different interpretations, I suppose, around why they happened and why those particular statues were targeted. But I think the overall point that I want to make is that whatever happens to particular statues, no history is being erased in any of those actions that are taken against any of those statues. History is being made in that people are making their views on those historical figures and what they represent, and that might be a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but that's the subject of the debate. And whatever happens to an individual statue is not the end of history or one definitive version, but actually a conversation and a dialogue that's just happening in kind of material form in public space. And it's what follows on from that, I think, that what really matters. In terms of actually trying to understand the different historical perspectives that are being expressed through the actions against or in favour of particular statues, and thinking about what those different perspectives really have to say to one another, and thinking about the past through those different lenses.
Okay.
Can I just come in on that as well and just say that I agree with everything Deborah said. I think the only history that's being altered is the very niche history of the history of statue erection. It really doesn't tell us any more beyond that. But I think in terms of impact, there's a short term and a long term. I think the short term impact of toppling a statue can be really quite significant. In the longer term, my own view is that the work that historians such as Bruce Baker undertake, which is to write contextualizing plaques that tell you the context in which a statue was put up, has a much longer and longer lasting effect on how we understand that. And I just, the only other thing that I would add is that I think that the very recent change in British public discourse that sees Britain trying to engage with culture wars, I think is rancid. I think it's the very worst aspects of the Brexit debate that have been stirred up by figures who should not have a voice, or well, should have a voice, but should have a very minimal voice, quickly drowned out in our political discourse. Culture wars are an American import that really don't reflect anything of the way in which politics and public discourse happens in the UK. I better stop there before I get in trouble.
Great, thanks, and thanks for Macaulay indeed for a great question, provoking really interesting responses. We're sort of at time, but I think we can run on for a few minutes. We've got a couple of questions. We've got a hand up from Gav, a question from Martin, and I also want to get to Lux's question about voting. So we'll go with Gav first, if you want to. Gav, do you want to chip in? Great, there you go.
Yes, thanks everybody. Really brilliant presentations. My question is for Guy, because I'm really interested in how the Raoul Peck film uses the defiant ones, especially because in thinking about kind of montage, collage, found material, we also see that in Spike Lee's representation of the murder of Eric Garner alongside representation of the fictional murder of Radio Raheem. We see that in Ava DuVernay's 13th, where she juxtaposes, well, matches up imagery of Trump with imagery of historical racism. And I'm just wondering, do you think there's a reason why directors are turning to this very specific aesthetic technique of collage or montage as a means of representing Black Lives Matter? What does it do that these filmmakers need it to?
It's clearly very powerful. I mean, I am partly sort of thinking, in a sense, obviously it's been selective, and that was my. I mean, I think for me, the good thing about the documentary was it pushed me to look at James Baldwin's own writing, and then there was a lot else going on there. But actually, the thing about the I'm Not Your Negro was that it really demonstrated the power of visual images. I think there's a broader trend in documentary in terms of more using found footage in a way that's become very common. But I mean, the simple reason in terms of why is partly just in terms of how evocative those images are.
That's great. Thanks. We'll move on. That got a question in the chat from Martin. I think probably for George. George, Martin's asking, do you think that the Black Lives Matter movement needs flashpoints? And Martin's given the examples of the Flint water crisis or George Floyd murder, given the flat organisational structure. And do we need those? Are those types of sort of really brutal moments of injustice necessary to challenge systemic racial injustice? I think there's an interesting difference between the Flint water crisis and the George Floyd murder, but I'll let George answer.
No, I would agree with you there, Alex, but I think it's a really interesting question. And again, looking backwards, historically, it has been not just crises such as the murder of George Floyd and the murder of other African Americans and other non-whites that has provoked crisis and then progress. It's also been the capturing those on media. And I think that's what has been so crucial to Black Lives Matter. And I think a really interesting, for any students listening, a really interesting future dissertation project might be whether the lack of a coherent civil rights protest organisation between the classical phase of the civil rights movement and Black Lives Matter was the lack of a means of publicising the kinds of brutal events that were clearly still going on. What happened in between Life magazine dispatching photographers to the South and social media allowing everybody to capture moments of horror and violence and racist violence. I don't want to ask a what if question, but had there not been social media, would there be a Black Lives Matter movement? I very much doubt it. I think that the better question to ask, though, is was that lack of coverage of those brutalities, which must have gone on. We know that they had to go on, but we didn't see them. And I think that provides one of the reasons why there is a gap in our knowledge of Black protest activism between the classical civil rights movement, our movements, parts of affirmative action, and then Black Lives Matter.
That's great. Thanks, George. It's such a shame we haven't got hours to elaborate on these answers. I'm going to combine questions from Lux, Hannah, and from Misbah. I'm going to try and do this coherently. So if Deborah thinks she's rambling, wait till I try and bring these questions into a whole. They're all about sort of voting and voter suppression. Misbah sort of made the point that Trump, in terms of casting doubt on the legitimacy of the election, has talked a lot about how mail-in voting is potentially a corrupt process. And that ties in some ways with the questions from Hannah and Lux about postal voting. Will that encourage a higher turnout of African American Black voters? And and Lux's question is slightly different, but related in terms of efforts at voter suppression, which there have been the sort of systematic efforts in some states, not all, it should be said, but in some states at voter suppression. How will that play in terms of thinking about what I agree, Lux's comment about the already fragile state of American democracy? Any thoughts on those questions?
Sorry, Alex, what was the question?
Protected by a screen. I've lost my bearings now. The issues around, I mean, do people think that Trump's rhetoric about mail-in voting, and particularly the anxiety about increased African-American voting, higher turnout amongst African-American voters, is that, what does that tell us about the fragile state of American democracy? And certainly one of the things that the Trump campaign engaged in 2016 was not persuading African-American voters to vote for Trump, but it was in voter suppression, not through trying to stop, not count votes or anything along those lines, but was an effort to just dampen turnout by putting out false and misleading information.
Can I say just two quick things about that? One is, I think it highlights, and this whole campaign has highlighted the differences between those who see voting as a privilege and see voting as a right, which again has historical antecedents. And also to reflect back on something that I said in I think the first of these sessions that we had. One of the things I think Trump will be very keen on is to create a narrative for why he's not going to win or why he may not win the election. And clearly one of the easiest ways for him to create that narrative is to say that the process was corrupt. That both might allow him some unconstitutional, un-American, to pick up on Zalfa's phrase, attempt to retain power in the White House by saying the whole system was corrupt. I think it's much more about his own ego and his own sense of self, that he needs to have a reason for why the American people didn't love him enough to vote for him again. And voter fraud would be a very easy way for him to create that narrative.
Yep. Absolutely. I want to throw in a question from Hannah's housemate in a second, but there's already evidence actually in North Carolina, early voting, the votes which are being discarded are disproportionately votes from African-American voters. So, yes. Good question from Hannah's, I assume, properly socially distanced housemate is, given, this is a good question, I think it's probably the last one we're going to be able to take. I know Macaulay's got his hand up again. Given how polarised American politics is at the moment, is it difficult to celebrate successes of the Obama administration in relation to Black Lives Matter when it was undone during the Trump administration? And is this something we could see in the future? Or will Black Lives Matter become a bipartisan issue? I don't think it's going to become bipartisan, but I'll let others answer the fundamental question there. Who wants to take that one?
I hate to give the pessimistic view, but I think if you look back to one of the reasons for the formation of Black Lives Matter, it was because of the frustration of what Obama was not able to do. And I think we valorize Obama, especially on issues of race, in ways that historians a generation from now will row back on. There are many different reasons for that, but I think Obama was not the great president that many African Americans hoped that he would be.
Yeah, I'm more of an Obama positive person. We'll leave that. Anybody else want to chip in on that? We've got a cheeky final question from Zoe, which I'll answer in a second. Okay, is 2020 going to be a breakthrough year for Black Senate candidates? I'm not hopeful. There aren't enough of them standing. One who would be really interesting to see win is Jamie Harrison, who's running against Lindsey Graham in South Carolina. Probably going to lose because it's bucket loads of money. And if there's ever a person who deserves to lose, it'll be Lindsey Graham. I think we'll leave it there. I know we've got a couple of potential further questions. We've already overrun, which is, I think, a testament to what a great session it's been. I'd like to thank our 4 contributors for a really interesting, really stimulating series of talks, and again to our audience, and especially our students, for some great questions. Remember, we've got another session next week, which will be a little more hardcore politics, I guess, in terms of thinking about the election. Hopefully I'll still be optimistic in a week's time. My optimism tends to last for minutes rather than days. But we'll see where things stand in a week's time. Thanks again. Please, please do advertise these events. We love putting them on. The more people that come along to these things, the more likely we're to do more of them. So housemates and everyone are welcome, and please, and even your enemies, and get them to come along. Thanks again to everyone for coming today, and hopefully we'll see you next week.